The term was used that I've written a book. I actually just have a manuscript. This has not been published and probably won't be published. This is what it looks like right now. It's typed paper. The subject of the book is camps and Donner. And when I say the term the Donner Party, what word comes to mind immediately? Starvation, cannibalism, something like that. And that is the word that's associated most closely with the Donner Party. I'm not going to talk about it, at least not very much. In the research that I've done about the Donner Party, the thing that sticks out to me is the courage, particularly of the women, of all of the people really. There aren't a lot of villains in this story. There is one, and I'll tell you about who I think is a villain. But most of these people showed extraordinary courage. I think if you think about being stuck in the mountains in the Sierra for 4 or 5 or 6 months, it's hard to even imagine what they went through. I became interested in the Donner story. He lived in Reno. And on hot days, we didn't have air conditioning, take our daughters up to Donner Lake frequently because it was about 10 or 15 degrees cooler up there. It was a higher elevation. And those of you who've been to Donner Lake, you've probably seen the memorial there, and you may have gone through the museum. I think there's actually maybe a new museum there open now. But I became interested in the story. I started reading everything I could there in Reno, and then when we went back to DC, Bob was working in downtown DC, and I was riding with his carpool. And I discovered that I don't think you have to be a citizen, anybody can go into the Library of Congress and do research. And they may have asked for an ID, I don't even remember that, but you go in, you can't check out books, only congressional people can check out books. But I could go in and I'd go through the card catalog, which at that time, this was many years ago, was literally a card catalog. It wasn't on any kind of computer system. And you just filled out a form, and within about 15 minutes, they'd bring you this whole pile of books, and you could just sit there and do research all day long. And you could also go to one section was old newspapers, and there's just all kinds of stuff there, which is available to anybody who wants to take advantage of it. And I did take advantage of it. I really did enjoy that. When we lived back east, as I got more interested in this story, my interest really did focus in on Tamsin Donner. She was the wife of George Donner, who was one of the leaders of the Donner Party. And I was able to find quite a lot about her, not really a lot that she had written, but things that were written about her or family members. She was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1801. And when we lived back east, I talked Bob into taking me up to Newburyport. I wanted to see the place where she was born. When she was 25 years old, she went down to Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and she taught school there, was married, had a family, and then all of her family died. And we went down to Elizabeth City, North Carolina also, and it's just sort of a typical, beautiful southern town. And during the course sort of my life, I was born in Nebraska. I was about 40 miles from Grand Island, which is one of the main first landmarks on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, which is basically the same most of the way. And then I taught school in Glen Rock, Wyoming, which was on the North Platte River, also on the Oregon Trail. So I had this background of sort of an interest in the Western Trails anyway. And then, of course, we lived in Reno. And as I was studying about this period of her life, which was from 1801 to 1847, I became really interested in what was happening in our country in that period of time. And the year 1846, which is the year that the Donners started out on their trek west, was really a pivotal year in American history. The Mexican War started then. The agreement was reached between the English and the U.S. on the border between Canada. Up until then, there was really, well, Washington particularly was considered English territory until that year. The Bear Flag Rebellion down in California was the year before, so there was just a lot of stuff going on that really was very effective in our history. The first wagon trains to California, and actually the first wagon trains that the whole wagon train made it the whole way to Oregon was in 1841, which was just 45 years before the Donners went. And one of the interesting places that I had heard a little bit about but didn't know much about was South Pass in Wyoming. And people who came out either to Oregon or California went over South Pass. Have any of you ever been to South Pass, or any of you familiar with that? Because I made him take you there. South Pass is a low pass over the Rocky Mountains, and until they started using South Pass, they couldn't take wagons. And I learned how important it was that they could take wagons, because before that it was mostly men that went west, so they went on horseback or mules sometimes. But when they started taking wagons, then they could take their household goods, they could take their women, they could take their children. And that really only had started happening in 1841. And so this was just like 5 years later that the Donners started out. There had been some people who had made it overland partway by wagon in 41, 42, and I think 44. Nobody had made it over the Sierras in wagons. And those people actually would go up to Fort Hall, which was the Oregon Trail, and then they would head south. The Donners are sometimes considered naive or incompetent or whatever, and I don't really think that way. I think they were unusually unlucky. In reading, I think it was an El Nino year when they made this trip, because the storms started earlier than they had ever historically started, as far as the few years that people from the U.S. had been in California. And it rained in the valleys all winter long. Any diary you read of that year, they just tell about continual rain. And when it was raining in the valley, of course, it was snowing in the mountains. As we've gone to these different places, if you travel in the western part of the United States, and if you go on I-80 between Reno and Salt Lake City, you basically follow the Donner Trail. Not completely, but most of that way you really have been on the Donner Trail, which became the California Trail, which became now I-80. And anyway, as we visited these places, especially like South Pass, there were no other people there. I mean, it's on a highway, but it's not a main highway. And so you could just envision what it was like, what they saw, because you pretty much see the same things today in many of these places. If you go over the salt desert between Wendover and Salt Lake City, how many of you have driven that? I mean, it's just that white expanse. And if you take the road out of there, that's what they faced. And to me, it's scary even today. I want to be sure I've got water and plenty of gas. Go on that road. It hasn't really changed that much, except it's a highway. Anyway, talking about Tamsen Donner, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I know about her early background, and then about the decisions that she had to make when she was caught up there in the Sierra. She, as I said, she was born in 1801 in Newburyport, Massachusetts, which was an important town at that time. It was a center of shipbuilding. It's north of Boston, and it was really a center of trade. Her uncles were important men in the town. Her family on both sides, both father and mother, traced back to the 1630s when they came to this country, which that's only, like 10 or 15 years after the Pilgrims. So her family had been in this country for a long time. She was highly educated. She taught school in Massachusetts, down in North Carolina and also in Illinois. And I think she was just an unusual woman for that era. When she was 7 years old, her mother died of tuberculosis. She was the youngest in the family. She had an older sister and two older brothers. And within a year, which I think was kind of the standard thing then, her father remarried. Her stepmother's name was Anna Cogswell, and she really loved this stepmother. This wasn't a cool stepmother story. And as I said, when she was 24 in 1825, she left Newburyport, as far as I could tell, made this trip by herself down to North Carolina. And there she was the head of the female department at the Elizabeth City Academy. And she taught school there 3 years. She met a man called Tully Dozier. He was from actually a slaveholding family in North Carolina, but I do not think that she and her husband had slaves, because in his will there's no mention of slaves, and normally they were mentioned in wills at that time. 3 years later, their little 2-year-old boy died in September. A premature daughter died in November, and he died on Christmas Eve. So in just a very few months' time, she lost her whole family there. She did go back to teaching school for a while, and then she went back to Newburyport. She got a message from her brother William, who had moved to Illinois. His wife had died. He asked her to come out and help him take care of his children. He had no children. So again, she made this trip by herself from Massachusetts to Illinois, and at that time, the Erie Canal was open, but there wasn't a real regular, easy route to get there, and I don't know exactly how she did get there. She taught school there for a while she was taking care of her brother's children, and she met and married George Donner. She was 38 years old, he was 53 when they were married. He had been married twice before. He had grown children who also lived in Illinois. His whole family had come from North Carolina to Kentucky, then Indiana, then Illinois. And they were among the early settlers in the Springfield area of Illinois. And he and his brother Jacob had even gone down to Texas and back. And so when people say they were inexperienced, I think that really isn't true. I mean, they've been traveling with covered wagons, halfway around or across the country. They had 3 daughters. Very quickly, Frances, Georgia, and Eliza. And when they started out on the trail to California, those little girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. I'm not going to talk about the trip across the country. You probably all read Oregon Trail stuff and know pretty much what that was like. They started Independence, all the Platte River to Fort Laramie and beyond, through South Pass, I was talking about. And then after they had gone through South Pass and further west, instead of going up north to Fort Hall, which was the standard route at that time, they went to Fort Bridger, which was a trading post that Jim Bridger had opened just a couple of years before. And they heard about, they didn't really meet this person, he's the person that I called the villain. Lansford Hastings had written a book, and it was supposedly a book about the trails to both Oregon and California. The problem was he hadn't actually been, he had been to Oregon, he'd gone to the Oregon Trail, then he went down to California from Oregon, and then he went home by the Santa Fe Trail. So he had never been from this Fort Bridger area to Sacramento. And in the book, it makes it sound like it's just pretty much an easy downhill run. He said it was no harder to get from Fort Hall to Sacramento than it was to get from Independence to Fort Hall. He didn't really know anything about what the trail was, but he had written this book. They carried it with them, and unfortunately, they believed him. And that's where they got in trouble. When they got to the Wasatch, which was west of Evanston, Wyoming, it took them 3 weeks to get across the Wasatch. There was no trail across the Wasatch at that time. When they went across the Salt Desert, that big white expanse out there, 5 days And by the end of that time, they lost a lot of their livestock, and they were really in trouble at that point. So anyway, on October 30th, they got to what would probably be basically the Reno area, and the snow started. And they thought, from what they had heard, you know, it might snow, but the snow would disappear, you know. So they stayed there a couple days to try to get their oxen in good shape, and it just kept snowing. And the snow eventually reached height of 10 to 15 feet. And if you've been to Donner Lake and seen the monument, it's a pioneer monument. It's not specifically the Donners. But anyway, it's way up high. The base, and that is actually how high the snow was. The top of the base tells you how high the snow was that week. And it snowed for many, many days, and they were trapped. There was no way that they could get over the Sierra. There wasn't really a trail in the Sierra anyway, but people had actually gone over on horseback. And so they were there. As I said, there were 4 reliefs that came. Finally, one group of the party, they were called the Forlorn Hope, and some of the younger, stronger people took off on snowshoes. This was in January. This again was 2.5 months after they were first stuck there. And some of that party made it to Sacramento, or to what was then Sutter's Fort. And they started sending these reliefs out. There were 4 of them. The first one got there on February 19th. That's 3.5 months after they were trapped there. And there were, I think, 7 men in that relief party. There were 87 people in the Donner Party. And a lot of children. I'll tell you the numbers on that. But anyway, Tamsen and George decided that they would not send these 3 little girls, that there just weren't enough able-bodied people to carry that many kids over the mountain. They did send George's 2 daughters, and they were 12 and 14. They did send them to that first relief, and they made it. I think almost everybody in that first relief made it. And then the second relief, it came on March 1st, a couple weeks later. George had injured his arm in an accident, and George and Jacob Donner never ever even saw Donner Lake. It's named after them. They were stuck up, it's about 8 miles, I think, north of Truckee, on just a little creek called Alta Creek, and they got to me there too. and I mean, they got stuck there, and he was getting sicker and sicker. He begged Tamsen to take the little girls, and leave. And she said, no, I won't leave you. And so she paid a couple guys with that second relief to take them. They took them to the lake. That's where they were going to be going over the mountain. And those guys just left the little girls there. And so anyway, she found out, actually that was kind of a good thing, because that second relief they ran into such terrible winter storms that several of the young children actually died on that relief. So then when the third relief came, somehow she found out that they were there. She went to the lake. There was one teamster left that stayed with George. She went to the lake, said goodbye to these little girls again, you know, that was the last time they saw their mother, and that was the last time, of course, that she saw them. On that relief, there were enough people to carry, and very few children left, and so those 3 little girls made it also, even though they were 3, 4, and 6 years old. She offered a man who she actually knew $1,500 to take it, and he said, no, I'm not going to burden myself. Of course, there wasn't much paper money, I'm sure would be a burden. He said, no, I promise you I'll get them across, but I will not take your money. So anyway, the 4th relief came in April. On the 17th, there was only one person left, and his name was Kingsburg. And he said that after George had died, Tamsen had come to the lake, and she had got lost. She stayed out overnight. She was suffering, from exposure, and that she died the next day. And he did admit that he had eaten her, but he he claimed that he did not kill her, and because he was actually, that was kind of the story that everybody was telling. Nobody liked Keseberg. Of the 87 people, they never did find her remains at all. They did find George's body with that fourth relief, and he was wrapped in a blanket, and she had taken care of him when he died. Of the 87 people in the Donner Party, 43 were adults and 44 were children. 28 of the children were under age 12. 17 of those were 5 or under. So there were a lot of little kids, including, I think, 5 one-year-olds. Only one one-year-old made it, but most of those, 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids did. 39 people died, 48 survived. 2/3 of the women and children lived, 2/3 of the men didn't. And most of these men were young teamsters. They were in their 20s and 30s, and they died before any of the one-year-olds died. And so this was sort of like, they didn't really have anything to live for, apparently. And those mothers did everything they could to keep those children alive. And I just think all of the women just were particularly courageous. None of the adult Donners made it across the Sierra to California, but all of the George Donner children did. The 3 little girls and the 2 that would have been stepdaughters to Tamsen. Tamsen had 24 grandchildren born in California. All of that whole family stayed in California. Her sister, who was still alive back in Massachusetts, wrote and asked somebody that had been a leader if he would send the children back, but they didn't want to go back. They actually stayed in California. Her 24th grandchild was born in Washington, D.C. because her youngest daughter married one of the first California representatives, and they went back in D.C. at the time that this youngest child was born. And so she has quite a family that grew up. Just to give you an idea of how quickly events moved, the very next year, in 1847, many Mormons followed basically the same route to the Salt Lake Valley. If it had been a couple years later, there would have been Salt Lake City there for them. There, of course, was nothing there at the time. California became a state only 4 years after the Donner tragedy. And in 1918, this memorial statue that's still there was dedicated near the east end of the lake. Eliza and Frances Donner were there, as was Virginia Reed, who was another child that was on in the Donner Party. All of the Donner girls lived into the 20th century, and Leah, who was one of George's daughters, Tamsen's stepdaughter, she died in 1930 at the age of 96. And it's just interesting to think about how close to our own era that was, that there was a member of the party. And I think the thing that just struck me about Tamsen, she was faced with this horrible choice. She did the best she could, both as a wife and as a mother. And she did choose to stay with her husband, but she did everything she could to make sure that her children did survive, and they did. And so I just consider her a real hero. Okay, and any questions? As I say, I've done reading and research on this a lot, and this is just a brief synopsis. But does anybody have any questions about this?
I thought it was interesting, is talking about coming from Wyoming by a certain way. My grandparents came from Wyoming in 1912 to Lakeview, and I was wondering if they come that way, by wagon.
If they came by wagon, well, it's hard to tell.
It took 2 months.
It's possible, it really is.
And I don't know if they came with other wagons or on their own.
Yeah, that would be find out.
The Southern Pass, is that due east of Wagon?
No, South Pass is actually, it's west of Casper. At Casper, the North Platte turned south, but the trail went straight west and then hooked up with the Sweetwater River. It's actually South Pass, let's see, I'm trying to think.
So-
It would be west-
So you're way north of there in South Pasco.
It's west. It would be southwest.
Well, the
of
mountains are north and south.
Yeah, I know. I don't think I have anything. I did bring,
I'm just curious.
yeah, it's quite a bit west of Laramie. And now does the North Platte doesn't actually go through Laramie.
No, North Platte's a funny river, it goes way north and hits back
Right,
south.
and see, they were following the North Platte until they got to Casper, actually. That was another place where I lived, was Glen Rock, Wyoming, which was Deer Creek to them when they came through, and they actually noticed seams of coal in the hillsides there, and when I lived in Glen Rock, that was a big coal mining area north of the town there, but the people even who were writing diaries in 1846 saw that, but they followed basically the North Platte River. Like in Ogallala, they turned north and followed the North Platte River until they got to Casper, and then when it takes off down, there's a couple reservoirs down there. I can't even think of the name.
Huge one there at Casper.
Anyway, they went off west, and they went past Independence Rock and through Devil's Gate and then South Pass.
The Donners came through before the Mormons came to Salt Lake.
The year before.
Beautiful.
The year before. Yeah.
Now, when news got out of this terrible tragedy, it's a wonder that anyone tried to do that again, or did they just?
The next year nobody did, but then of course something happened in 49, which was the discovery of gold, and then lots of people. Plus, by that time, Salt Lake City was there. There were places to get help along the way. But in 46, there was just such a huge change between 46, 47 actually, and then 49. And of course, it was because of the discovery of gold that California became a state so quickly. But I didn't realize until I did research. It was only 4 years after the Donners came through that California became a state.
Where do we see the initials on the rock?
That's at Independence Rock, and that was a real landmark on the Oregon Trail and California Trail, which is basically the same until you get
To Salt Lake, isn't it?
Pardon?
When you get to Salt Lake, that's
Well,
it's
no,
kind of
actually,
split, isn't it?
yeah, the Oregon Trail actually in far western Wyoming, it went up past Bear Lake up to Fort Hall. And that's how the people who were, the people who had come the years before, that were going to California, they went that way and then went down from Fort Hall. And actually, Lansford's Hastings route was longer than if they went up to, it doesn't seem like it would be, but they went up to Fort Hall in Idaho and then went down. There were people 2 years before the Donners who actually came in on the Malheur River, some of them, and when that was part of their route to California. That was a group that split up. The people who came, the first one, the Bartleson Party, is considered the first really overland who really tried to do it in wagons. There were families, women and children, and they gave up on the wagons in eastern Nevada. They knew that San Francisco was west. They had a compass, and among them, and I can't remember how many, 50-some people, they had $100. And they all made it. I mean, that's why I say the Donners were unusually, they were better prepared than some of the very early groups. They just happened to pick a bad year and a bad route.
Well, that was very interesting.
Anyway, I did want to just mention, I read probably hundreds of books, parts of hundreds of books, but the ones that I really paid the most attention to were ones that were written by contemporaries. And one of them is Expedition of the Donner Party, and this was written by Eliza Donner. And she was only 3 years old, and this happened to her. These are her memories written as an adult. She's the one that married the representative, and lived in Washington for a while. And then, was written by Virginia Reed, and she was another member of the family that is from Illinois, from the Springfield area. And she was a little older, but she wrote this as a memory too. But I figure even young children, something as traumatic as that happened to them, their memories, they may not be accurate as far as, dates or that sort of thing, but I just really drew on those a lot. And in this little book is the Diary of Patrick Greene. He was an Irish guy, and he kept a record of the weather. And he was at Donner Lake. He wasn't staying at the same place the Donners were. And that just gives you an idea of how the snow would come and come and come and come. So anyway, but there are lots of books written about it, and it is an interesting subject, and she was an interesting person, I think.
Thank you.